So as you know, just before Christmas, I did a teisho on the birth of the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, and Jesus of Nazareth. And then a few weeks ago, spoke about the role of suffering, the vision of suffering in each tradition. So today, considering it's Easter week, thought I'd talk about resurrection in both traditions, Buddhism and Christianity. Surprising, eh? But there is a lot of fascinating stuff to say, I think, and to experience about this. First of all, in both traditions, it's already happened. All right? So it's not something you believe in that's going to happen later. It's primarily something that happens now. And in Christianity, the text from Colossians we read every Easter says, if you've been raised with Christ, and Ephesians says, Colossians, they point out, well, you've already been raised, you've already seated in the heavens with Christ, you've already been raised. It's already happened. So that's what we should be experiencing. We're already being raised. Well, obviously not after death, physically raised, but we're already sharing a whole new consciousness, a whole new vision, a whole new life that we didn't know before. And that's what we should already be experiencing. Now you can draw a connection with that, with Buddhism very easily. A pivotal text, bringing the two together might be Ephesians 5, where it says, an early Christian hymn, "Awake, sleeper, rise from the dead, and Christ will give you light." So that's about now. Right now we should be waking from sleep and rising from the dead and receiving life. But lo and behold, that's exactly what the Buddha says. Wake up, right now. Rise from the dead in that sense. Rise from your, illusions, from your being dead. You're not being fully alive. You're not being fully yourself. And of course, that's what Buddha means, the awakened one, the one who's awake, the one who is enlightened. So the Buddha would be the first, Zen would be the first to say, you already should be experiencing this new state of being awake, fully alive, a whole new life from what you knew before. So in that sense, we're talking about something very similar, if not identical, that's already happened or already should be happening. It has nothing to, it's long before we start talking about physical death or physical resurrection. Okay, that's the first main point. And the most important thing for us right now. Now, when we do start talking about, physical death, it's very interesting to compare the two, Of course, Jesus died a violent, cruel, unjust death. Whatever theological import you give to it, that's the actual fact. Whereas the Buddha, died, 50. He was almost 50 years older than Jesus and was 80 years old. And what happened was, as you may know the story, he was on a journey, and a blacksmith gave him hospitality and gave him what turned out to be bad pork, bad food, and that was the end of the Buddha, And the Buddha realized it as soon as he had eaten it. But in both cases, Jesus and the Buddha, the reaction was forgiveness. Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. And he just tried to reassure the poor blacksmith who didn't mean to cause any harm. He said, don't worry about it. The Lord says, Jesus, in addition to feeling abandoned by his Father, also said, "Into your hands I commend my spirit." And apparently, as reported, the last words of the Buddha were, he died at Kushinagar. I was there, and they have, of course, a beautiful monument there. He basically said, brothers, remember, all things pass away. Basically, he said, the way of all flesh. Everything is impermanent. That's one of his primary teachings, and so he applied it to himself very peaceably, very resignedly, and then said, brothers, work out your own salvation, your own well-being. Apply yourself to the Dharma, and that's quite similar. So both died in the sense of, abandonment to the mystery of life. Now, Interestingly enough, the Buddha, actually died a couple of days later, and what happened was, if you've ever seen the parinirvana sculptures in many countries, they're often huge in Thailand and elsewhere, where the Buddha is lying on his right side, facing north, and this was the position he was in, as he expired. And sometimes these sculptures are like 100 feet long. I mean, they're huge, and then they're on the feet. There are drawings of like chakras, the circles. Those who know reflexology would be all into this. And if the circles, the chakras, aren't on the feet, then it's just an image of the Buddha sleeping. But this is an image of the Buddha dying, what they call the Maha or Parinirvana, where the nirvana is not just what we already have, but the Paranya, the great one when you move beyond this world. Mahasamadhi, as you sometimes call it in Sanskrit. And interestingly enough, in many places you actually have, this is Walking with the Buddha, the pilgrimage that I went on some years ago, and they actually have a picture on the front of the Buddha's feet. And it reminds me very much, if you've been to the Holy Land, of all these pictures of the feet of Jesus standing on a rock before his ascension. So in both cases, maybe strangely, there's this interesting iconography of the feet of the person, which is curious, even though used in slightly different ways. But both, imaging of going to a higher place, a different place, beyond the space and time in this world. It said that at the Buddha's death there was earthquake, just as there was at the crucifixion. Remember that earthquake, the earth shook. So literal or not, these are earth-shaking experiences, literally. And that the Buddha was buried with perfumes, and just as Jesus was, with the shroud of Turin. So all of that was similar. There's a great devotion to this parinirvana. The Shinyoen, the Buddhist group that is basically kind of like a Japanese-Tibetan style Buddhism. That's their main devotion, actually, to the Buddha at that moment, at that passing. So it's very interesting. Of course, difference is that the Buddha was cremated, right? So that's that. Or is it? Well, let's see. And the story is, and it could very well be true, these are the stuff of legend very much, that the Buddha's ashes were, because kings and princes were fighting over them by this time. As usually happens with holy people, their followers wind up fighting. So they wanted to divide the ashes so they divided them to 8 groups and spread them out. And, you have stupas, where the ashes are kept, and for other people as well, and they're also an image of the human person and their enlightenment. That's the iconography of stupas. But anyway, that was the Buddha's fate. But we're going to add something to that in a minute. Now, of course, as we know, and most of us believe, Jesus was physically raised. However, how are we understanding this? Richard Rohr, in his wonderful new book, The Universal Christ, has a whole chapter on this, and I'm going to be quoting from it in a minute. Too often, especially in Western art, when they finally do present it, for the first 600 years or so, the resurrection was not depicted. Think about that. It's only until the Middle Ages that you get depictions, and it's usually in the West of Jesus holding a white flag or something, and coming out all by himself. Whereas in the East, you have the harrowing of hell, and he's rescuing Adam and Eve. So it's a much more communal thing. It's a cosmic event. It's not just, as Richard Riley says, it's not just touchdown Jesus. Aha! You're doing a touchdown dance. I rose from the dead. I'm God. That's not the point. You're missing the point. The point is that there's a cosmic significance to this. That, the whole universe is risen. It's a whole new reality. And here's where you get a little bit closer to something that Hindus and Buddhists might recognize as well. Now listen to this, it's really important. What happened at Jesus' resurrection? There's a whole section here in Richard Rohr. He was fully revealed as the eternal and deathless Christ, the eternal Christ in embodied form. The one circumscribed body of Jesus of Nazareth morphed into ubiquitous light. Now that's literally true. Right? That's why Jesus could appear in all sorts of different ways, during that first week or weeks after his resurrection, because it wasn't just like a resuscitated corpse. It wasn't just somebody coming out of a tomb and standing there and saying, whew, it was, they even say that the shroud, remember, was supposed to have like a sign of like almost this flash of energy, depicted on it. Whatever you might think of that, that's kind of what happened. And he points out that the communitarian aspect of it. There's a verse in Matthew 27 that no one ever quotes. I've never heard it quoted by anybody, where at the moment of the crucifixion, of the death of Christ, the tombs are opened and the saints come out bodily and later appear in the city to people. So wow. So there are consequences to this, that it's a communal thing, not just in fact affecting Jesus. Anyway, then they began to understand him more and more as Lord, of course, revealed as light, as at the Transfiguration and elsewhere. But this is the interesting part. He says, back in 1967, my systematic theology professor, Father Ciaran Maus of the Franciscans, told me that if a video camera had been placed in front of the tomb of Jesus, it wouldn't have filmed a lone man emerging from a grave, which would be resuscitation more than resurrection. More likely, he felt it would have captured something like beams of light extending in all directions. Absolutely. Absolutely. It's physical. It's energy. Matter and energy are the same thing, as Einstein pointed out. So it's not that it's just spiritual. No, it's physical, but it's energy. It's pure light. In the resurrection, the single physical body of Jesus moved beyond all limits of space and time into a new notion of physicality and light. Absolutely. Read the description of the resurrected body in 1 Corinthians 15 and that we're all going to share, and you'll see what I'm talking about, which includes all of us in its embodiment. Christians usually call this the glorified body. And look what he says. It is indeed similar to what Hindus and Buddhists sometimes call the subtle body. Now what he's referring to there is what we call the Sambhogakaya in Buddhism. It's not like the eternal, Dharmakaya, and it's not just like the manifest Siddhartha space and time physical body, which is the Nirmanakaya. But the Sambhogakaya is very much like this. It's like the transfigured physicality, the pure light and energy of the physicality. It's very similar to what we're talking about here. And would Siddhartha have achieved that or been that? Well, why not? This is not early Buddhism. This is more Mahayana philosophy or theology, but it's very rich. That's what we also mean by the halo around saints, this light, the physicality of light. So we might better describe this as Jesus' universalization. And of course, Siddhartha, the Buddha, is universalized too, at least in this sense. Sort of an Einsteinian warping of time and space, if you will. Jesus was always objectively the universal Christ, but now his significance for humanity and for us was made ubiquitous, personal, and attractive for those willing to meet reality, capital R, through him. Many do meet divine reality without this shortcut. In other words, they reach this kind of transformation without specifically referring to Jesus, which is what many in the world do, of course. He says, we must be honest about that, he says. But I believe Jesus is there in that transformation anyway. How could he not be? Well, the Buddha too, for that matter. How could he not be? It's everyone and everything. Still, people who are properly aligned with love and light, in whatever tradition, will always see in good ways that are not obvious to the rest of us, and we still call that enlightenment. So whether you're Christian or Buddhist, you can be enlightened in this way and see the Christ, be the Christ in these dimensions. People of the light will quite simply reveal a high level of seeing, both in depth and in breadth, which allows them to include more and more and exclude less and less. So that's how you can tell a real enlightened, transformed, resurrected person in whatever tradition, how broad and wide is their inclusivity. To the extent that they're excluding anybody or anything, they haven't gotten it yet. Period. That is the only proof they will ever offer us, and that's the only proof we should ever need, he said. Wow. I'm not sure how many Christians ever really thought of this, of that dimension of what the resurrection really means. And in that sense, wouldn't the Buddha have Siddhartha Gautama share it? We all do. We all are called to. Karl Rahner, in his theology of death and resurrection, said that every one of us expands to the dimension of the whole universe when we die, if we're open to it. Christ the firstborn, if you will, but then we're all called to that. And who is not? Who is not called to that? The scriptures say that Jesus fills the universe in all its parts. Jesus is all in all. Well, it's either all in all or not. And whoever is in that level of enlightenment is all in all as well, including Siddhartha and including us. But there's one more thing, even in Buddhism, because Buddhism doesn't talk this way, of course, in terms of physical resurrection and all of that. But listen to this. This is fascinating. This is from the Denko Roku, the record of transmitting light from the 13th century, and under Nagarjuna, who was the great Mahayana theologian of the 4th century. And I've quoted from this before, where we talked about the whole universe as one jewel. I've given teishos on this. So the whole universe is one jewel, radiant and glorious and firm and clear. And the whole universe in the 10 directions is one bright jewel. But the wish-fulfilling jewel, and it's called a wish-fulfilling jewel because what wish is not fulfilled by this? It's called a grain of rice. In other words, it's nourishment. And this is thought to be a precious jewel. When the Buddha Dharma is extinguished, in other words, at the end of the age, call it the parousia or the end of the world, the Buddha's relics, remember the cremated ones, will become jewels. Rain down on everything and turn into rice to benefit living beings. So whose body now is one great jewel that turns into bread to benefit living beings? So the resurrected body is also nourishment. We're being nourished by this or these resurrected bodies. And then we believe that as Christians in the Eucharist, right? Or don't we? Even though it is revealed as a Buddha's body. Now, hold on. I mean, if you get this sentence, you're way better than I am, but go ahead. Even though it is revealed as a Buddha's body, as a grain of rice, as the myriad things, or as one brightness, when one's own original mind is revealed, it becomes this fathom-long body, a figure with 3 heads, animal forms with horns and hair, and an infinite variety of other forms. The mind jewel. All in all. Everything. The Buddhists are saying this. And so are we Christians. Or we should be, anyway. And so when you get right down to it, well, there's only one reality. Where's the difference? You may know the stories. You can Google it and find articles about this in the Tibetan tradition, about some of the arhats, the masters in recent centuries, who, when they died, became rainbows in the sky. Well, that's what we're talking about. The jewel, I mean, the cosmic dimension, pure light in all directions. So this is the way the universe is made. You know, it's not some isolated miracle, touchdown Jesus, or whatever you want. It's actually the way things work. And the more deeply and fully and truly we live it, or live it as Jesus did, live it as Siddhartha did, live it as so many have and will, the more the more we'll be it, we'll share it, we'll understand it. So awake, sleeper, rise from the dead, and you will be enlightened.